Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is for Grant Writing 101. I'm Kellen Moody, one of the Assistant Directors for the Alumni Affairs Office at Berklee, and I'm pleased to introduce our presenter and your fellow Berklee alum today, Danielle Parillo. Danielle is the Senior Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations at Berklee. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. Please be sure that you are muted, and if you have any bandwidth issues or any issues connecting, if you just turn off your camera, that should help with that. If you have any questions about the presentation as we go on, please feel free to put that into the chat function. I'll be moderating those and passing them along to Danielle for Q&A at the end of the session. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Danielle.
Hi, everybody. Nice to virtually meet everyone. As Kellen said, I'm the Senior Director for Corporate and Foundation Relations at the college. I'm also a film scoring alumna, so it's really exciting to be able to talk to all of you, talk to you about what I do, and help you out with seeking grants. It's a really important skill to have, to know how to write grants. I've clearly built a career on it, and oddly, my film scoring background was sort of my segue into grant writing, as I worked with a documentary filmmaker for a few years, and that was my first introduction to learning how to write grants or anything about grants, or even knowing what the word grant was. So without further ado, I don't want to take too much of our time with introduction, so I wanted to just get into the presentation, and I'm still learning how to man the ship here in terms of sorry, this WebEx thing, but in any case, so a little bit about just the environment about grant seeking. Obviously, as many of you probably know already, it's very competitive. You know, it's really hard to just start getting your foot in the door and start getting those first grants. So, you know, just know that you're not alone. A lot of people get declined initially. So, but don't give up, don't get discouraged. The more you educate yourself about what it takes to develop a strong proposal, a strong budget, and so on, it will help you jump those hurdles. And I'll try to give you some tips as best as I can about just where good sources are for those first grants. You know, I think there's a bit of, you know, getting started can be a little bit overwhelming. There definitely are some resources out there to help you identify which opportunities are going to be the best for you, depending on what you're trying to do, whether it's, you know, you're applying as an individual artist or as an organization that's doing educational or social justice work around the arts in your communities. I'll try to kind of straddle those two potential roles that you might be playing. But just a little bit to take a step back and to understand, you know, what a grant is and who it is that's generally awarding grants. Funders are nonprofit organizations themselves, so that would be charitable foundations or government agencies that are awarding funds that are appropriated from some kind of a municipal or a federal budget. And so you really are entering an agreement. It is a type of a contract, so it's a little bit different than an individual gift, and because of that, there's a little bit more process involved in obtaining a grant, and then also on what are the requirements once you have a grant in terms of reporting back on those dollars. So I just wanted to kind of give you that little bit of a background, because it's really important to understand that as nonprofit organizations themselves, funding agencies, foundations, corporations, or government agencies also have philanthropic missions in how they award their funding. So it's really important to find a good match for what it is that you're trying to do. So you know, research and getting background on the donor is going to be really important. If it's the National Endowment for the Arts or the local arts council, they're all going to have kind of a different goal for each grant opportunity. So it's important to familiarize yourself with that grant opportunity, what the goals are, and then to make a point in the proposal to link what it is you're doing with being a good investment in for the funder to meet their own philanthropic goals. So you're sort of partnering together to meet shared goals. So that's like a really important thing somewhere in your proposal to articulate. And there are some places where you can kind of just go to jump in and get started. I think the local and the state arts council, so here in Boston, for example, you know, the Massachusetts Cultural Council. In New York, I'm sure many of you are in New York. That would be the Department of Cultural Affairs. There's the local arts councils like the Brooklyn Arts Council or the Queens Arts Council. And there's the New York State Council for the Arts, better known as NYSCA. There are other resources, again, like the New York Foundation for the Arts, but these are all places where you can go to start getting some insight, not only into opportunities that are available for individual artists, because those are really good sources for that type of funding, but then to just, you know, get involved and look at what they might be offering in terms of, sometimes they might have a funders list. For example, here in Boston, the city of Boston has a funding list that comes out every couple of weeks, and it really lists a bunch of grant opportunities, both for individuals and for organizations. So that's a good place. Pretty much the gold standard for research on foundations and foundation giving is the Foundation Center. And it actually is a physical place. They keep volumes of profiles and on pretty much every philanthropic foundation that's out there. They also have an online directory of funders. It is very expensive to have a subscription to that online directory, but it's free to go to the Foundation Center. And they have physical locations, I know, in New York and San Francisco, in Las Vegas, I believe, and maybe a couple of other places. I think Chicago is one of them. There are links at the end of this PowerPoint, so I will introduce you to that. But that's a good source of funding. There's other sources out there, but that's a good place to start. And I know that they have now expanded and have several partnerships with libraries across the country. So I do believe that there are now ways to access that resource online through public libraries, or if you're in grad school, your college that you're enrolled in now may have a subscription as well. I do not believe Berklee has one, but I can look into that as well. So that's a little bit of background. So once you've identified a funding opportunity, I think the most important thing to do as soon as you possibly can is to really go to the funder's website and read what are the guidelines, what are the eligibility requirements, everything that you need to know about that grant application as soon as you possibly can. Because it does take time to put together everything that you need to submit a grant proposal. It's just great to get in there and make sure, one, that you're qualified to apply, and then two, that you have the time that you need to get all of the information gathered that you're going to need to develop a strong proposal, budget, and other supporting documentation that you may need for that proposal. And so sometimes you might have to do an interim step like register to apply or submit what they call a letter of intent, which is just sort of an abbreviated proposal. So again, you know, it's just good to be familiar with these things. And so I'm going to go ahead quickly and switch out just to give you a you know, an indication of what I'm talking about. So here we have the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and this is, you know, their website about their artist fellowship program. So it tells you, you know, just what you need to know. What is the range of the awards that they make? You know, who's eligible. So if you know, it's drawing and printmaking, poetry, traditional arts, choreography, fiction, right? So you need to make sure that you're in the right discipline, and there's different deadlines for different disciplines. And then here's what I'm talking about in terms of eligibility, right? So you have to be 18 years or older. You have to be a resident of Massachusetts for the last 2 years. You have to be creating original work. If you've already received a fellowship in the past 5 years, you can't apply again. So all of these types of things are important to know before you go ahead and go through all the work of putting together an application. And so that's what I'm talking about. And pretty much, I will say that most grant applications now are on some kind of online system. So you're going to be applying this way online, and they're going to have, a landing page where you can go and you can get all of that information. Funders really want you to have the information you need. They do not want to sift through proposals that aren't eligible for funding and all of that. So they make it pretty clear. And usually there is a contact person who you can call. Some foundations can be a little tough trying to get through, but definitely for government, local arts councils, they're very responsive if you email them with a question. They will often have webinars and all kinds of information sessions as well. So just keep on top of those opportunities you're interested in and find out as much as you can. Things that are typically needed are things like maybe an artist statement, biographies of key musicians, artists, whoever's going to be working on the project, artist work samples, a project plan. Work samples are another big one for performing artists, and this is why I say it's really critical to go in, look at what the requirements are, and there's actually often guidelines and further instructions around the work samples themselves. They can be very specific, what formats are acceptable. You have to have them queued up to exactly where you want the panelists to review the work sample, and so on and so forth. So it could be very time consuming to put all of these things together, not just the proposal itself, but all of the other supporting documentation that may need to accompany your grant application. Okay, so once you've determined you're eligible to apply and you know all of the things that you need to have gathered, you can start developing your proposal. And you really need it to be a compelling presentation of your project. It should include, reasonable objectives. What is it that you're trying to accomplish by doing the work, and what your plan is, and how capable are you for carrying out the plan? So you want to show evidence of successful projects in the past, and so on and so forth. You should definitely, as we said earlier, show that you're a good potential partner for this particular funder in furthering their mission, not just somebody who's kind of seeking out the money. So you should always be using that words of like, I'd really look to partner with XYZ Foundation to help, bring, arts education to needy kids in XYZ community. That kind of statement is really important to make in your proposal. So I'm going to toggle out again. Actually, wait, I'm going to go a little bit further, and then I'll toggle back out. I do have a sample proposal that I want to go back and forth on with you guys. So generally, there's just a few rules of thumb. I know you might hear a little bit, that grants are kind of like resumes and cover letters in a way that you shouldn't just have a template that you shop out to everyone. But I do think that developing a strong kind of template proposal for yourself is really useful. Sometimes you can just send out your template proposal and personalize it for each funder as you can in certain areas. But just having some of these sections that we're going to talk about developed in a document that's ready to go is always, I think, helpful, especially if this is a program that you're doing year over year. So if you're a small arts organization, for example, template proposals are probably going to suit you pretty well. So, and usually, as a rule of thumb, you really don't want to go past 5 pages unless it's a really big project or there's some compelling reason to do that. It's just sort of a standard format. Most proposals are going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 pages. Cover letter, again, this is depending on the foundation. Sometimes you're still going to have an opportunity to submit a cover letter. Most of your submissions are going to be digital, regardless of whether they're a proposal that you just send to an email somewhere or you submit them online. With online applications, it's a little harder to do the cover letter. And in some ways, I think that's, it's like submitting a resume in some ways without the cover letter. It is just one more opportunity to introduce yourself, your project, and so on. So make good use of that space if you have the chance to do that. So again, some of the elements of a proposal. So obviously a cover letter may or may not accompany, but starting from the beginning of the proposal itself, you're generally going to start out with some kind of an executive summary, just a very brief couple of sentences just briefly describing your project. in an online format, they will just ask you for a brief, summary of the program, and they will usually give you some kind of a word count, and it's usually only about 250 words at the most. So that may be something you want to keep in mind. A summary is going to be something akin to maybe 250 words at the most. So brief and concise is really what you're after there, just a high level. And then you're going to usually have some opportunity to just give an introduction either of yourself if you're an individual artist, or just background on your organization. And so here I think it would be good for me to start toggling a little bit and show you this sample proposal. This again came from the Foundation Center's Grant Space resource, which is, again, at the end of this PowerPoint, there is a page that has some resources for you. I highly suggest that you go there because you can download sample proposals, and there's nothing better than to just look at some good proposals, strong proposals, and they're just sorted by every kind of category you can think of. So this is one from an arts organization, St. Luke's Chamber Ensemble. So you can get a great idea of what a good cover letter looks like. Again, in their summary, you can see that it's very brief. They really just talk about, again, they also quantify the amount that they're asking for. I didn't say that earlier, but it's really important to put up front that I'm seeking a grant of $5,000 to do X, Y, and Z, to support a 6-concert festival, so on and so forth. So they've done a really good job of kind of outlining here what it is they plan to do with the funding and how much they're asking for. And, it's important to note here that they've had previous support from the foundation, so that's also really important to put up front. Foundations, the good news is once you do get a grant from a specific foundation, they often will, it's much easier to get another grant from that particular foundation. Some foundations will restrict, you can only apply every other year or something like that, because they don't want to just continue over, just it to be assumed that they're going to continue to fund you. But generally speaking, as long as you're stewarding their funds really well, and they're happy, and they don't change their focus, or you don't change what your focus is too much, there will continue to be a nice partnership there. And then here they get into what is their mission. And they do a really good job. I like how they've kind of bolded out here in a separate box, just a very brief overview of their mission. Committed to making classical music vital and relevant for 21st century audiences. So again, they do a pretty good job of just kind of it's a good place to showcase, again, maybe some of your highlights of your organization, or if you've recently gotten a great review, you recently completed a fellowship somewhere, and now you're ready to kind of take your work to a new level. This is a place where you can kind of highlight why you're a good partner, and why you're kind of a standout to do what it is you're doing in your field, in your community, and so on and so forth. All right, so I'm going to toggle back out a little bit. It feels strange to not be doing Q&A in real time, but I'm sure there's questions coming through. Again, once you get through the introductory pieces, then you really get into the body of your proposal, which is really a really detailed description of the project that you want to undertake. I'm putting here, just kind of in grant funder terms, generally speaking, foundations, being philanthropic organizations, they really want to address some type of a need in the community, whether that's supporting young composers who are developing their careers, or increasing access to arts education for kids in underserved communities, that kind of thing. You really want to put your statement of need or intent. So again, if you're an organization that's going out into the community, providing artist services that's going to support, elderly people or underserved kids or youth in your community, it's going to be a little bit of a different kind of a need than maybe more of a statement of intent, where you're really aligning yourself as a young composer in the early stages of their career, right? That maybe that foundation really wants to support that kind of a mission. So you really want to kind of outline yourself as meeting that goal of theirs. And then your project description, and we'll go back to the proposal in a moment, but really here you really want to be clear about what it is you want to accomplish, right? So I'm going to, the who, what, where, when, why, how is really what you're outlining here. It's like any other kind of business proposal that you might be developing. It's really kind of outlining what it is you plan to do in very concrete terms. You really want to avoid too much jargon, but again, you want to wrap around those kind of concrete details, just some of that language that bridges, your goals with what their philanthropic mission would be. So let me take a quick jump out again, and we'll come back to the proposal just so you can see. Again, it's very hard to read through a whole proposal here, but you can just kind of see how clearly they've done this here. I need to get rid of this. Okay. It really outlines here. It's a series, presents repeat performances of recently written works and premiere performances of new works, many commissioned by St. Luke's, showcases virtuosity of the ensemble, champions composers and their work. Right? So they're really kind of saying what it does. And then they're getting into the details of, this is really their needs statement here. They're building new audiences for contemporary music and contemporary art, stimulating thinking about audience development. So there's multiple layers of goals and outcomes that they hope to accomplish. And then they get more into the details. Here's where it's going to take place. A series of 3 Saturday afternoon concerts in the Chelsea Museum of Art, 3 repeat performances in the galleries of Dia Beacon, so on and so forth. So it's really it's very clear and concise about what's going to happen when. Here they get into the who, involvement of world-renowned composers, some of the past composers, and further down they talk about who they've engaged to be involved in the project should they receive the funding. So it's very clear, there's a couple of aspects. This is a fairly detailed proposal, but again, they get very detailed. Here's another second part of this is another 6 concert festival of American women composers. And again, they get into the detail of it. So they do a really good job of clearly and concisely outlining just all of those details that the funder needs to know. And as we work through this, we'll talk soon about how that ties into what you present in your budget as well. I'm keeping my eye on the time. Okay. So again, once you've gone through and you've outlined what it is you plan to do, what needs you're addressing, what your goals are in terms of maybe reaching new audiences, developing, building your body of work as an artist, whatever it is that you're writing about and what your project is about and what goals you're going to accomplish, then they're going to want to know a little bit about, well, how are you going to know that you're successful? What evaluation do you have in place? And so you need to keep in mind as you're writing your proposal, if you're saying that you have goals for audience development, how are you going to track the audiences, right, that are coming to your performances? So you need to do a little bit of project management here and think through, okay, well, for selling tickets, are we using something like an Eventbrite? Can we track who's coming? We can certainly track the number of people who are coming. If we're doing outreach in schools, we can certainly track the demographics of the students in those schools. We may not know every single student, but we can sort of extrapolate from this school overall. Every school district has what they call a report card, and they do report on their demographics. If you're doing free performances in a community, it could get a little bit more difficult because nobody's buying tickets. For example, we've had series like that here at Berklee, and what we tend to do is to look at the community demographics. Why are you going into that community? Well, this is a community that doesn't have access to live quality live performances. There's no performing arts venue within 10 miles, and so on and so forth. And we know through data demographics that we're going to be able to hit certain target audiences that we want to experience this programming. So those are the things to keep in mind, things like how many people attended, how many children you reached. If you were, if it's a commissioning work, they'll probably want to see a copy of the score, something like that, right? They'll want to see documentation of performances, premiere performances, and so on and so forth. Usually that's what those kinds of proposals entail. So again, if we come down here, there's a good kind of description of, what is their outreach going to be? What is their marketing plan? How do they plan to reach these audiences? I'm trying to look for numbers, but I'm not seeing specific numbers here, but I'm sure that they're here. I just can't remember exactly where they are in this proposal. But again, they're talking about this their mission and how are they going to, in each of these sections, because this is set up a little bit differently than what I'm going through. There are, they touch on all of these points. So they're talking about, outreach, visibility, and again, with marketing, keeping copies of the collateral. So if you developed posters, for example, having copies of that, we put up the, this many ads and in a particular publication or online or however you decided to market your program. Those are all kind of indicators of the reach of what and scope of what you've done in terms of your project. So again, evaluation, I think in terms of the kind of programming you're doing, that's going to sort of drive, if you're talking about educational outcomes, then you're probably going to be looking at, okay, well, the kids, if they participate in this program, they're going to develop skills in music literacy, reading notation, how are they going to demonstrate that learning and knowledge, usually through some kind of pre and post testing, maybe assignments, homework assignments, performances throughout the year. Are they given a grade? All of those things are methods of evaluating whether or not you've achieved your outcomes. So certainly if you're doing educational programming, as you probably know, the expectations for outcomes and indicators and learning, evidence of learning or evidence of movement along the continuum of like youth development outcomes is going to be asked for. So those are things that I think if you're doing that kind of programming, you probably already have curriculum, scope, and sequence and all of those things kind of in place anyway and know how to evaluate those outcomes. So just important to keep in mind that you do have to have some plan for tracking what it is you're doing and whether or not it's considered successful based on what are the normal indicators for whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Pretty good, right? All right, so everybody's favorite part of the whole process, budgets and funding statements and, what do you include? I like this proposal also has a budget that we'll look at because it gives you an idea of what typical budget line items are, particularly for arts and performing arts programming. But it's also important to indicate in your proposal somewhere just outline in a narrative form what the costs are of your project, provide some context. If you have a good amount of money in your budget for travel, it's really important that you include in your proposal why you need the money for travel. So if it's, well, we're going to be doing performances in 3 different cities across the country, then obviously you're going to need to move your ensemble, the composer, and other people involved in the project across the country. So you're going to need to articulate travel in your budget and in your proposal. So that's why it's important to be really detailed about the who, what, where, when, why, and how in that proposal project description. Really important so that it's clear everything should align. if there's something in your budget and it's really not talked about in your proposal, it's going to maybe raise a little bit of a red flag. Why do they need $2,500 for consulting? What's this consultant? Well, maybe it's support for marketing, right? But just somewhere in, that's why it's good. I always put a separate budget and funding statement in proposals that I develop. And that's where you can say that we also need support, external support to design a poster or do whatever it is. And hence, that cost is $2,500. So you'll see that in the budget as well. So it makes it clear. Make it as clear and easy as possible for people to understand your costs or your estimated costs for the project. The other thing that's really important and that they've done really well in the St. Luke's proposal that we've been looking at is just stating, most importantly, whether or not this funder has funded you in the past, always be clear and thank them and iterate how important that funding was to help you achieve your goals, and that you look forward to continuing that partnership going forward. But other funding sources, receiving that local arts council grant, while it might be a small grant, it's really important because those grants are usually evaluated and approved by a panel of your peers, right? So it's usually a panel of artists and experts in a particular field that are reviewing those grant applications. So it's a really strong vote of confidence in the quality of the work in the project that you're doing. So it's always really important to state who else is funding your work or has funded maybe different projects that you've done as well. Funders are always, just like we do, like we network in our day-to-day lives and in our worlds, funders do as well. So they always want to know who among their colleagues are supporting projects, or artists. What are they doing and who are they supporting? And it really speaks volumes if they say, oh, ABC Foundation is funding them. That's a really tough grant to get. So it's going to actually help you if you cite other sources of support. And then, other sources of revenue. No funder wants to be the only source of funding. In rare cases, certainly for an artist fellowship, that's a different thing. But if you're applying for project support, it's always great and important, really, to have some other sources of funding. Nobody wants to be the only one supporting what you're doing. And that doesn't mean that it has to be other grants, although that's really great if you have them. If you're selling tickets and you're projecting that you're going to have some ticket revenue, then that's really important to show. And I think some people sort of wonder, well, do I have to show that, I don't have any money? No, it's important to show that you're sustainable as a program. Where the funding comes in is that, you're typically going to be selling tickets at a low cost so that you can get audiences to come, or you might be doing a program out in the community that's free. That's a different thing. So there's some revenue coming in, and then you're asking for funding to help underwrite the cost of that discounted ticket, right? So those are really important concepts to try to get your head around. There are some really good resources out there. Again, go to GrantSpace because there are definitely resources that are just focused on budgeting. And maybe this is something, if everybody likes this webinar and we want to do a future grant webinar, we can focus more on project budgets and the story that a budget tells, because numbers tell a story. And I'm toggling back to the actual sample budget that we have here. And you'll see that there's expense. So this is the cost of the project. And then this is income. How are we planning to support it? And so we always want these two numbers to zero out. We want to show that we have a plan to support the project that we want to do. Okay, so on the expense side, these are some of the typical line items, particularly in performing arts. And again, we talked a little bit about there might be restrictions on what funders will and will not fund. And so it's really important when you're looking at those guidelines to look at the budget guidelines, because you'll see that they may not want to support a lot of staff salaries like administrative support, but they will want to support the artist fees and the composer fees and the artists themselves, which are usually contracted personnel, artistic personnel. And so here you'll see in the salaries, wages, and benefits, they're very clear. So it's clear what the funder is really interested in, right? They're 100% of the composer in residence and 100% of the assistant composer in residence. But only 5% of the salary of the director of artistic planning. This is an administrative position that would be supporting this program, right? So it's just a small amount of their time every year that is going to go to supporting this. But it's a real cost. It's a cost to the organization. So it's important to include. Same thing with the production personnel. And then we get into artistic and other fees, and it's really important here that they've actually they have, you know, each one of those sort of sub under this line item, this category here, excuse me, I can't talk all of a sudden. It's really detailed out. So the musician's fees and what's included in that, you know, cartage, pension, FICA, right? So they're including all of the musicians' costs. This is their ensemble. You know, commissioning fees, travel for the composers, honoraria, symposium honoraria. Other costs that you're probably going to have if you are a producing entity, so say you're an ensemble, you're a touring company, if you're a dance program, you're probably going to have to rent space for rehearsals and for your presentation. So you might come to the BPC or another presenting organization to present your work. Instrument rental, I suppose, if you need it. You know, music, you might have licensing fees, that kind of expense. Marketing costs, these would be things like design, you know, taking out ads, and all of these kinds of things like marketing collateral, really good to keep samples. So when you have to report back, you have examples of what that looked like. Transportation, that could be just ground transportation back and forth, you know. Archival recordings, it can be things like, you know, videography. You want to have a record. As we know, those work samples are really important. You want to have a record of the work that you've done. So those are all costs that are acceptable in a budget like this. And then this is that sort of dreaded overhead. This is only for organizations. If you're an individual artist, you're not going to have overhead. But what that really is just a percentage of the administrative overhead of that organization. So, you know, the cost of keeping the lights on, keeping the phones on, keeping staff, you know, computers, all of the things that it takes to make these things happen that are really hard to put in a line by line. But so generally what most organizations do is they have what they call an overhead rate. Usually it's 10 to 15%. And most foundations will not fund more than 10 to 15% of overhead. So it's really important to try to keep, if you are including overhead, to keep that in mind. Usually that's going to be really clear in the guidelines. Some of them won't fund overhead at all, so don't include it. Or if you are going to include it, you might need to put column of like where you're going to apply that donor's funding in particular, and it's not going to be allocated to overhead. But just best to not include it at all in your project budget. And so on this side, on the bottom here, we have the income. And there's two categories of income. There is earned revenue, which are things like ticket sales, and if you have anything what they would call auxiliary sales, like if you're selling t-shirts or CDs or other collateral, that would all be included in your earned income or earned revenue. And then contributed income or contributed revenue will be other grants or contributions that you have. So if you did a Kickstarter campaign, you can put that in individual contributions. And I might even put here from a Kickstarter campaign. And then kind of listing the other foundation support. And then really important to, as a separate line, put the request from that particular foundation. And they've done a really good job. Some foundations will actually ask you to identify whether or not you've received the funding or you've only applied. So that's what this pending and received is down here. Okay, so sometimes you submit an application and you don't know if you've gotten the funding or not yet. So sometimes I think it's a really good habit to get into when you're doing your budget section in your narrative. It's important to maybe state that, if we're planning for the cost of this project to be, $250,000 as it's outlined, if we didn't receive the funding, from, some funders like the National Endowment for the Arts will actually explicitly ask you what happens if you don't get as much money as you're asking for. So you might say something like, well, we would still do the project, but we might not go to 3 cities, we might only go to 2, right, to lower the cost. So think about that as well. All that kind of information and detail is really helpful to a funder, to help them know that you've really thought through how you're going to manage your project and the funding. So I don't think we have too much more time, but I do want to talk a little bit about stewardship. We talked really early on that grants are a type of a contract, so you're really entering into an agreement to do the work. So there's generally, I always draft an acknowledgement letter, and with that comes the responsibility of just indicating that for IRS tax deductible purposes, no portion of the grant, no goods or services were exchanged for any portion of the grant. But most likely you're going to also get some kind of a grant agreement or a contract that you need to sign. So it's really important to review the terms of that agreement. There will usually be some kind of requirements to credit the funder, like in your program. So if you're doing a live performance and you get a grant from the State Arts Council, always important to thank them in the program, put their logo in the program. And that's why it's justified, those marketing costs, right? If you're having to print a program to acknowledge the funder, then it's fair game to ask them to support that. So just be aware of what those requirements are, and make sure that you're meeting them and that you're documenting them, so that when you go back and you have to submit a report, you have PDFs and you have documentation of all of the things that you've done, that you've met the requirements of the grant agreement. Timely reporting is really the best way to make sure you get the next grant. It's the best way to showcase that you are a smart bet for continued funding, that they made a good investment in supporting your program or your project. And then one other thing that I wanted to just talk about really quickly to touch on is that I know there's probably a lot of you out there that are saying, well, I'm not a nonprofit organization, how do I apply for a grant? Because all these grants are saying that I have to be a 501c3. And so there are opportunities that you can use what is called a fiscal sponsor. And that's basically when a larger organization will support your project in the community. So technically, I mean, any other nonprofit can do this, but there are some really good resources. There are organizations that do it sort of as part of their programming, advocacy groups like the Arts and Business Council. So there's a link here that you can follow. Advocacy organizations like Fractured Atlas. Some of the local arts councils will have resources of organizations, and there is on the resources page, there's actually a fiscal sponsor directory, so you can look up anywhere in the country where there are organizations that will do that. So that is, I think, quite frankly, if you're an ensemble applying for a few grants a year, it's not worth it to go through what it takes to become a 501c3. That's a really long process. You have to go through incorporation in the state and then apply for tax exempt status at the federal level. It's something akin to about $1,000 to go through that, just to pay the fees to do it. And you're really backed into then a corporate structure. You become a corporation. And so you're obligated then to do things like make sure that you submit your 1099 filings on December 31st every year, like all of these things. You have to have board meetings and have a board, and it's a lot of work to become a 501c3. And one of the reasons why fiscal sponsorship exists and why a lot of funders will accept that, especially if you're an individual artist or an independent ensemble, is because they understand, like, there's so many small 501c3s and it's a struggle, And in your case, it may be much better. So there are a lot of resources that you can read into, but I do think that that's a very good option, especially even if you're a small grassroots organization who's just getting started, it's a good option. So I think I used all my time. How'd I do?
That was great, Danielle. Thank you so much.
We
do have a few questions. A lot, and we will be sharing out both the recording of this presentation and Danielle's presentation to everybody that registered today. So if you didn't get it all or were taking notes, no worries. You'll be able to reference it later. We did have a few questions come through that I'll go through and ask. The first was, for these proposals, is it best to have a very formal Word document or a nicely designed portfolio involving a graphic designer? Does it really depend on the foundation and the grant itself?
It does depend on the foundation and the grant itself, but I do think, as I said early on, I think it really is great to go ahead and develop for yourself a really nice kind of template proposal. Go through the PowerPoint and look at each of those sections. And I absolutely encourage you to go to Grant Station, because they have resources there. You can look at a bunch of artist statements, at a bunch of project descriptions, and you're going to find a project that's probably aligned with the work that you're doing, right? So I focused a little bit on performing arts here, but there's tons of resources for visual artists as well. I would look at the kinds of grant opportunities you're interested in and look at what they're requiring for those work samples, and also have a library of ready to go formatted work examples for yourself. And you're going to have to update those year to year. Have your artist statement ready to go, have your CV updated. All of that's really important, just like when you're doing anything else where you're networking, right? You have to kind of update them every year. But I do think it's good to get those templates developed, that first round of developing this language. And again, especially if it's the kind of programming you're doing, you might change year to year, but you're probably going to do a commissioning project every year if you're an ensemble, right? You're going to have commissioning, you're going to have performances that you're doing, you're going to have concert series that you're presenting. So yeah, I think it's a good idea to develop a template language, knowing though that every funder is going to probably ask the questions differently. So having the language ready to go, but being prepared that you might have to pick it apart and reassemble it if there's a very specific format that they're asking you to follow, which with the online applications, it's more and more like that. It's harder to just have a template proposal that you send out. I hope that's
awesome. Thank you. So the next one is actually about working with a paid professional grant writer rather than kind of doing it as an individual or as a group, hiring somebody to do it. Can you talk about any resources that you know for either hiring a professional grant writer and kind of what the steps are involved with that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the resources. There are professional grant writing organizations. I don't know off the top of my head, but here's what I would say. Even if you're hiring a professional grant writer, a lot of this information, you're still going to have to provide it. So, depending on the size of the organization and what the amount of time that you have, I think it's a great idea if you know someone who can help you with the grant writing. It can be expensive to hire a professional grant writer as a small organization. It's generally very much frowned upon to include the fees of a professional grant writer in your grant proposal. Don't do it. It's just kind of like a, what do you call that? A faux pas, but a very serious one. So most foundations don't like to see that services of a grant writing professional in the proposal itself, fundraising fees. So it kind of depends, but I would say that the caveat there is to just be prepared that you're still going to have to provide all this information to the professional grant writer. And I think there's a lot of resources to do it yourself, but just know that. And knowing that up front means that you can be prepared to just send them. I mean, the grant writer's going to love you if you're ready to send them all this information. They can help you with some of that higher level language, but I think for the most part, most people can do it themselves, just take the feedback. I mean, if you're going to, especially if you're going to local arts councils or some of the government grants, they're actually really, really good about giving you the feedback, right? They will give you the panelist comments. They will let you know where your proposal fell a little short. And that's really great feedback to have. So, I mean, I guess it's dependent on your situation, but understand that it can be expensive and you're still going to have to provide a lot of information.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question, and there's still a few more coming through. So just to say, if we didn't get to your question today, I will share these with Danielle and we'll follow up so we can get those answers out there. But the last question is probably a good one. I know I've run into a few times, but between the intent and the project description and the abstract and the cover letter, it can feel like you're repeating yourself. Is it bad to do that? Is that okay? Is that kind of normal? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know that's just, it's good writing. And again, I think the summary, obviously it's going to repeat. It's meant to kind of summarize key information. I think trying to keep as clear as you can the distinction in each part of the proposal. So when you're giving some of that background information, that artist's background information, you might not want to repeat. If you're highlighting certain accomplishments in that section, maybe when you're down in your proposal narrative or you're talking about other funding partners or other successful projects, you might want to choose different examples. And again, making sure that you're keeping the sections of the proposal distinct. I think what you're asking though is sometimes the way that foundations set up their proposals themselves. I run into that too. And sometimes it's impossible not to be a little bit redundant, but you might have to find creative ways to say the same things a little bit differently. I do struggle with that as well. So I think that's what you're getting at. That's a tough one without like concrete examples. Maybe that's a good thing to try to tackle in a future workshop that's more of like a workshop, but I hope that was adequate.
That's awesome. Thank you. So just a huge thank you to you for taking your time to do this today. I think we had great attendance, and thank you to everybody who joined and everything like that. If you are interested in attending any more of our events, we actually have a few coming up next week talking about the Alexander technique and self-care during this time that we're all in, as well as the future of live music. And then Roger Brown actually has one coming up on Thursday looking at COVID, Berklee in the fall, vaccine possibilities, all that stuff. So information about all of those can be found either on the Alumni Facebook page, or if you just go to berklee.edu/events, you can find the information about that there. Again, we'll definitely once this is all packaged and recorded, we'll be sharing this out with everybody. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email them to alumniaffairs@berklee.edu, and I can get those over to Danielle. But yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.